Welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk about why you would pick a Mac over a PC for a music production environment. Now, this is not to start a fanboy culture war type of thing or anything like that. This is talking about legitimate reasons why you would pick one over the other. And I want to highlight that I am currently on a Windows computer. The reason why I'm making this video is because I want to shed some light on it, because you do a Google search and a lot of people just say pick one or the other. And for the most part, that is accurate. You can just pick whatever. But if you want to know the reasons why you would pick one over the other, or some potential gotchas down the road in the future, then let's talk about it. That's what this video is for. So like I said, I'm still currently on a Windows computer. It's an i7 6700K. So it's an older chip. It's like, I think 2015 or so when I bought it and built it. And I built it too. I've built all my PCs. Our editing rig is an AMD 3900X. My previous gaming PC was an i7 7700K. So, you know, I'm aware of all this stuff. And I'm also aware of the Apple side as well. In fact, when I got into music production, Logic Pro, or Logic I should say, was on Windows. eMagic was the name of the company. And then Apple bought them. This was like late 90s, early 2000s. And then that's what made me buy an Apple computer, because Logic was purchased by Apple. So I was like, oh, well, I have to buy an Apple computer now, because I really liked Logic at the time. Fast forward today, I use Ableton, but that's besides the point. So I switched over to Apple in early 2000s. It was like the Power PC, the G5 was on that, and then they came out with the Intel architecture, Mac Pros, basically around 2014 when I switched back to Windows computers. So I have a pretty good perspective over using both operating systems for music production specifically. So the first reason I would say that you would want to pick Mac over a PC legitimately is if you're working with people who are largely on GarageBand or Logic Pro. Now this is putting aside any preference of which operating system you currently prefer. Like if you're new and you could choose whichever, then the Apple basically has most of the doors open for you if you go that route with the Mac. Because again, if you're working with people on Logic Pro, you're gonna have to like bounce down or export stems or trackouts, or get a computer that can actually open those files and work with those. So like I said, if you're doing a lot of productions with people that are on an Apple format, you might just want to jump straight to Apple and not worry about it. So that's one consideration. Some myths that people like to throw around is that like Apple computers are gonna make you more creative or some crap like that. That's just marketing mumbo jumbo. Their interfaces are nice. You know, I actually do like the operating system from Apple, but like I said, I've used both Windows and Apple for years at a time, and I can get the exact same type of work done on both, sans the type of software, if it is specific to Apple. Now, prior to the M1 architecture being released, the Apple Silicon, it was more expensive to go with Apple, and you'd have like weaker hardware. It was definitely cheaper to build a Windows computer before than going towards Apple. But nowadays, if you get a Mac Mini, an M1 Mac Mini, which will cover the majority of your needs, they're actually relatively affordable in comparison to Windows computers. Even if you buy the components by yourself for a Windows computer and build it out, it's going to be pretty close in price to what the M1 Mac Mini can do. But you do have to deal with building your PC. You might like that. I like building PCs, so I don't mind it, but you might be adverse to it, so it could be a roadblock for you. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that like the M1 architecture has kind of brought down the walls of like the pricing discrepancy that there was. You know, Apple computers still have a bit of a premium on them, but it's not like it was before. With the type of power gains that you do get with the M1 architecture and the M2 and all that, it's definitely worth considering just going that route off the get. Now, one issue is RAM. And the problem with the M1 architecture right now is that you're locked into the RAM that you choose when you buy the computer. So you should opt for higher RAM if you can afford it. If you're doing large orchestral projects, you might want to stick with a Windows computer, because you'll be able to get large amounts of RAM for way less money in comparison to an Apple computer. The Apple Silicon architecture does allow you to have some flexibility with the hard drive in the way it treats memory. So even if you do just get 8 gigs or 16 gigs, it's not that it's like 16 gigs relevant towards a Windows computer. It's a bit different, but some of the software still has to be optimized to be able to utilize that kind of architecture. So it's not a complete like transference of, you know, you have like a whole hard drive full of memory or something like that. In the case of sample libraries with large amounts of data for orchestral sounds and all that, you could run into problems, and you might need a more powerful machine, you know, upwards of the $2,000 for the Mac Pro or $4,000 or whatever. And at that case, then you should weigh your options of whether or not you should just do a powerful Windows computer with a ton of RAM versus a Mac. That's consideration. If you plan on doing large orchestral sample library type of productions, then you could run into issues with the lower end M1s, M2s, and all that. Like my current computer here has 64 gigs of RAM, and I've had no problem with a bunch of large orchestral library samples being loaded up in there. Now I have read reports that other people haven't had issues on like the Mac Mini with 16 gigs of RAM. Software optimization does play a big role in that. That is one consideration. If you're doing large orchestral library type of productions, you might want to stay on the Windows side for now. But if you're just doing regular beats, like if you're making trap beats or synthwave beats or something like that, like there is no reason why you can't literally just stick with a base M1 Mac Mini and be very successful with that setup. And this is also treating it as a studio computer. So that means you're not gonna have 50 different tabs open in Chrome or Safari or whatever. You're going to treat it as a production environment. Like that's, you plug it in, that's your production computer. Maybe you got to add some videos or something like that on there. It's a great option that is relatively affordable considering the Windows side of stuff that's available. You might be thinking like, oh, well, you can get a used Windows computer or something like that. Well, you could do the same thing for Mac as well. Like you could look for used Mac Minis and the deals are going to be pretty good in that case. Okay, let's get a little bit deeper in the weeds. There is some architecture things that does make Apple computers better for music production when you have an advanced setup. Now, like I said, if you're new, you're just starting out, maybe you bought like a Focusrite 2i2 or something like that, none of this is going to apply to you. You can ignore it. You can pick either one. You can pick an Apple or a Mac, doesn't matter. But once you get a bit deeper and your track counts go up significantly and your recording track counts go up, let's say you're recording 16, 24 channels of a band or something like that, this is where things can get a bit more tricky on the Windows side. So Windows has ASIO, and it's a low-level API format that communicates hardware to software. Steinberg made it years ago. It's relatively old at this point, and it doesn't, as far as I understand, it doesn't really get like updates to its architecture. And it could use some updates. For one, it is a single audio interface architecture, meaning that you can only use one audio interface with ASIO for a particular application. Now on the Mac, you have Core Audio. Core Audio is newer, but it's more flexible. So it tends to be more reliable, and it's also more flexible in the sense that you can actually hook up multiple audio interfaces via the aggregate and have them work together for one application. That does introduce some problems when it comes to latency, like jitter and stuff like that. So it's not a bulletproof solution, but it is a solution that exists. Whereas on the Windows side, there is no solution that exists that is actually workable for a production environment. You could say ASIO for all, but that's not gonna do it. Like it's a different type of setup. It causes way more problems from personal experience. So if you have multiple audio interfaces, then an Apple computer really is your best bet in that particular scenario. But again, if you're starting out, you don't have multiple audio interfaces, so it doesn't matter. So like I said, the other thing that is a problem on Windows computers is the way they handle MIDI, specifically MIDI USB. The way Windows works is that an application locks the MIDI USB driver. It doesn't share. It's saying its communication is locked to it. It will not let other applications talk to that MIDI driver until it gets released, or you close the application. Core Audio allows you to have the MIDI driver shared amongst a bunch of applications, so you don't have this problem. Why would that be a problem? Well, let's say Moto Electronics, like the Cobalt and all that. If you want to use the plug-in interface to control like the features on there, while also using your DAW at the same time, you can't do that on a Windows computer. What happens is the MIDI USB interface gets locked by the Cobalt plugin interface. And this is also when you load it up as VST, by the way. If you want to use the Cobalt as like a MIDI controller for other stuff when you're not specifically using that plugin, then it completely overrides that and locks your ability to be able to have the Cobalt synth talk to the software or talk to your DAW as like a regular controller interface. That is a problem, and it's super annoying. Whereas on the Mac or the Apple side, that is not a problem at all. You can have multiple applications talking to one MIDI port, USB MIDI port, and it won't have any issues whatsoever. That's annoying. I've had to deal with that. The other thing too is some companies have poor driver support for your USB MIDI devices, like Korg. Korg is pretty infamous for having crappy drivers. So much so that my Minilogue XD module I still have hooked up with just regular 5-pin MIDI DIN with a different interface because the USB support is so crappy. I've had to actually use Meme's Mac computer to update the firmware on Korg devices as opposed to using the Windows computer. I'm capable of doing this stuff, but at a certain point, it's like, I'm done jumping through the hoops. I'll just take the easy route. And that's what I did with her computer, which is significantly easier. Some companies don't do Windows drivers very well, which that's something I didn't talk about on the ASIO side. So let's roll back to that. ASIO is a good API. Don't get me wrong, it's solid. It requires the companies that make the audio interface to write a good ASIO driver to connect to it. And herein lies the problem. Not all companies do a good job with it. And you could also have some older interfaces that just don't talk very well, unfortunately. So if you go the Windows route, you really should read reviews on drivers for your audio interface to make sure things are gonna be good. Like the Focusrite stuff, I have a first generation 18i8, and I had problems with the drivers on that, specifically for streaming. So I had to swap that out. I went with Steinberg for a while, and Steinberg was good. Currently what I use for main music production stuff is a Motu setup. I have a Motu 828ES, and I know Motu gets a lot of crap online, but I've actually used Motu products for a long time, and I haven't had the issues that other people talk about. Fingers crossed that it stays that way, but the drivers have been solid. You know, there's been a few times where I've had to reset the device or something like that because there's some weird hiccup that happens with the sample rate or clock sync or something like that. Things happen in the music production environment with digital audio that can be weird, and you just have to reset things at times. And also, Apple computers have the same thing that happen with that as well. Even though Core Audio is fantastic and for the most part bulletproof, it still can have issues. In fact, when I was on a Mac Pro back in the day, I would not upgrade to the latest operating system because notoriously it would break the drivers that were connected to, or it would break the connection for the FireWire devices that I was using, which was FireWire, so you know, it's archaic, older technology. Apple computers aren't immune to it either, but they do have a better track record, and also most devices just plug in to an Apple computer and work right away. Like it shows up in the Core Audio and you're good to go, essentially. You don't have to do any kind of fancy installs. Whereas with Windows, you almost always have to install some sort of driver, and hopefully the driver is good. It's a frustrating experience when your drivers don't work on Windows. It could be the motherboard, it could be the type of chip, you know, it could be Intel versus AMD, it could be a different sound card or like a network driver that's in there that's causing issues with the other drivers. So there's a whole list of things that can happen on the Windows side that is a pain in the ass. That being said though, I've used this Windows computer for the past 7 years for music production. A lot of this stuff does not matter when you're just starting out. My recommendation though is if you can pick one or the other, I would pick an M1 Mac. In fact, the Mac Mini, I honestly think is fantastic for music production. I might actually switch to a Mac Mini M2 when they officially come out. I'm not 100% sure on that yet, but we'll see. My recommendation is to do that because that way, if you are working with someone on a Mac, you know, like, or using Logic Pro or GarageBand, no problem. You can open up those session files. You're not gonna have any kind of issues with MIDI driver USB problems because Mac handles it better, just straight up, they handle it better. And I think more stuff like that's gonna happen in the future with hardware, where it's controlling hardware synths with MIDI information and USB information, all that stuff. I think that's gonna become more prevalent in the future with more releases. I'm spitballing a little bit right here. The Windows side has not updated the USB MIDI or the ASIO for a long time. Personally, I'd go with the system that's more flexible, which is the Mac side. I mean, if you hate Macs, you can't stand the interface, then obviously go with Windows. You'll be fine, you can get stuff done. But if you can pick one or the other freely, I would personally go with the Mac side right now. Also, the power that's available on the M1 and the M2 chips is good. Like, they're not weak by any means. All right, time to wrap up this video. Don't want to make it too long here, but that's my thoughts, discussion on the topic. We'd love to hear your thoughts below as well, so drop them in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, a like, subscribe, it goes a long way for the algorithm. And if you want to support the channel even further, you could use our affiliate links below at no additional cost to you. And we do have a Patreon as well. But yeah, that's the video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Deuces.